Thank you so very much. I am thrilled and honored to participate in this lecture series. As you may know, or some of you may know, a monstrous snowstorm prevented me from giving this lecture last year, and I feared that I might have lost my chance altogether. In fact, I confess that it even crossed my mind that this had been an elaborate sort of scheme to rescind the invitation. So I was delighted when Palma called me again, not long after the scheduled date, to say that you would actually like to have me try again. And we scheduled the lecture at a time in the school year that seemed less likely to be subject to the vagaries of weather. So this talk is based on my book, The Lawyers of the Right, Professionalizing the Conservative Coalition, which, as was just explained, explains what unites and divides lawyers for the major constituencies that have coalesced behind the Republican Party. But why do these lawyers matter at all? Who are they? Let me give you the big picture before I dig into the focus of my talk. So lawyers have played really important roles in the conservative revolution in American politics and law since the 1970s. They have served all sorts of nonprofits through which the conservative movement proceeds, including think tanks, public interest law firms, trade associations, advocacy organizations, and the like. They've built an impressive infrastructure for conservative legal advocacy, and in the process, they have assumed major roles in that movement, which is quite a striking feat, it seems to me, since the conservative movement historically has displayed considerable hostility to lawyers and legal activists. Lawyers' litigation organizations have challenged the political left's definition of public interest law and set their own aggressive law reform agendas. They have devised arguments for reshaping the law governing family, religion, education, property, employment, race, civil justice, police power, criminal procedure, trade, and international affairs. And they have sought to implement these changes through legislation and litigation. These lawyers have played enormously important roles in filling the federal courts with conservative jurists, and they have secured a working majority of justices on the Supreme Court. Lawyers are, in addition to all this, some of the most recognizable spokespeople for conservative and libertarian causes. So the book offers group portraits of the lawyers who serve the several strands of the conservative alliance that has coalesced behind the Republican Party, including social conservatives, libertarians, and business interests. And it analyzes these lawyers' characteristics, their values, their professional identities, strategies, networks, and the extent to which they and the organizations they serve operate as a coordinated whole. The book also speculates a little bit on larger implications of this research on lawyers' roles in American politics. Today, I'll focus on two questions that are explored in more detail in the book. The first question is essentially, who are these lawyers? What are their characteristics? In what ways are they alike and different from lawyers for causes of the political left? And what do they have in common with one another? Of course, it's well known that Republican voters are deeply divided. One only need observe the craziness, the disarray in current Republican primary contests to appreciate the degree of internal dissension in the Republican Party. Are there similar rifts among lawyers, the prominent lawyers who serve the different strands of the conservative coalition? Or do the lawyers share common ground that would make them likely candidates for unifying the coalition? I think it's not completely ridiculous to think that lawyers might actually play a role in coordinating cooperation, that their Similarities might swamp their differences, that their common characteristics and experiences might just draw them together and help to link the constituencies these lawyers serve. After all, lawyers are all members of one profession. The training of lawyers in this country looks remarkably similar across the country, although we at Irvine are trying to shake things up in that way. They have shared occupational interests and perhaps even a common perspective on the relationship between law and politics. Lawyers might be expected to tend to steer organizations toward litigation and other mainstream political strategies at the expense of more radical tactics, and they might tend to use their dominance in those policy arenas to help control and coordinate the movement. Alternatively, lawyers could be divided, just as the constituencies are. They could be divided along the lines of the interests they represent. So that's the first question. Who are these lawyers? The second question borrows shamelessly from Tina Turner. That's what's law got to do with it? What work do these lawyers perform? What do they do? What roles do they play in the conservative movement? Are they simply activists who happen to have law degrees, or do they bring something different, special, additional to their work for these causes? Are there ways in which they are alike and different from lawyers who serve causes of the political left? And how do these lawyers and their organizations influence the fate of the conservative movement? So I'll address these two sets of questions and speculate on some broader implications, possible broader implications, and then I'll eagerly seek your questions, your comments about the project's premises, the design, findings, anything else that interests you, and I really do look forward to hearing your reactions. Before I begin, let me say a word about methods. So the book draws very heavily on my interviews with 72 prominent lawyers for conservative and libertarian nonprofit organizations. The interviews grew out of a research project that I pursued jointly with Jack Hines of the American Bar Foundation and Northwestern, and Tony Peck, who's a sociologist at the University of Iowa. To define the set of lawyers to study, we drew a sample of conservative and libertarian non-governmental organizations that were active on a set of big policy issues. And then I requested interviews with a subset of these lawyers. And I identified 89 such lawyers, requested interviews with 89, and was able to interview 72 of them. The book also draws from a variety of public sources, legislative records, litigation records, tax returns filed by nonprofit groups, web pages, and other kinds of publicly available data. If there's interest, of course, I'd be happy to talk about methods, but I suspect you'd prefer that I focus on findings, so that's where I'll go now. Who are these lawyers? The first question. So the interviewed lawyers include some of the best-known advocates of the conservative movement, representing all the major constituencies. I'm sure you would recognize some of the names of the lawyers. But I assured the interviewed lawyers that I would not reveal their identities, so I'm not going to do that. I can't tell you who these lawyers are, but I can tell you a bit about their characteristics. And those characteristics are summarized in bare bones here. So they're overwhelmingly male. Just 5 of them were women. But that small proportion of women actually, I think, is quite representative of the elite ranks of the constituencies that were represented. That is, the leading lights of the movement and of the organizations serving these constituencies. The women have not broken in large numbers into those ranks. But I think it also reflects the larger place of women in the legal profession. That is, that if you look at the most elite ranks of law firm partnerships or other major organizations, the numbers of women at the topmost levels are not large. The interviewed lawyers ranged in age from late 30s to early 80s, but most of them were in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. They came from varied religious backgrounds. Protestants were most numerous, but Catholics and Jews were also well represented. Roughly half of them worked in advocacy organizations, and the remaining lawyers held jobs in think tanks, universities, trade associations, and law firms. They represented all the major constituencies of the coalition: conservative religious groups, abortion opponents, libertarian organizations, groups devoted primarily to business interests, affirmative action opponents, organizations concerned with crime and law and order issues, and mediator organizations. And I'll spend some time in this category, but these are organizations that actually seek to appeal to all the constituencies of the alliance to build bridges. Collectively, these lawyers served 69 nonprofit organizations, and they served in various roles as organizers, officers, litigators, scholars, and consultants. Almost half of them had attended law schools ranked in the top 20 in the U.S. News rankings, for whatever that's worth. Two-fifths of them worked in Washington, D.C. Another third worked in major cities, and the remainder worked elsewhere. I found some striking patterns, and without giving away the whole story, because of course I want you to buy and read my book, I'll paint in very broad strokes to give you a sense of some of the common characteristics of these four broad categories of lawyers: the social conservatives, libertarians, business interests, and the lawyers associated with these mediator groups that try to appeal across the constituencies. Now, of course, not every lawyer fits these broad characterizations, and the book lends nuance and detail that is very hard for me to convey in a brief lecture. But my research did find remarkably consistent patterns, which I'll describe briefly now. So the social conservatives, lawyers for social conservative groups. Lawyers for these groups came primarily from working class and middle class backgrounds, and many of them expressed mistrust for economic elites and secular institutions. Few of them worked in major metropolitan areas. They were heavily congregated in rural areas in the Southeast and Midwest. Roughly 2/3 of them had attended local or regional law schools, and only 1 of 25 had clerked for a federal judge. They generally said that they were highly active in their churches and highly committed. It was completely commonplace for lawyers in the interviews for these lawyers to talk about the role of God's will, to discuss the role of prayer and calling in their lives. Their mentors and sources of inspiration included ministers, priests, and prominent leaders of the religious populist wing of the movement. Most of these lawyers emphatically rejected conventional professional norms, at least those according to which lawyers are not morally accountable for the clients and causes they pursue, the means and ends they serve as lawyers. The libertarians, so many of the libertarian and affirmative action opponents also came from modest backgrounds. Many of them reported that their fathers had held working class jobs or had run very small businesses. They were disproportionately Jewish, but their ranks also included 9 Protestants, 3 Catholics, and several other lawyers who reported that they weren't religious. Many of those who indicated that they were associated in some way with a church or synagogue said that they weren't particularly active. 10 of the 23 libertarians and affirmative action opponents had attended top 20 law schools, again, U.S. News rankings, and 4 had clerked for federal judges. These lawyers were heavily concentrated in Washington, D.C. and the West. They generally expressed passionate commitment to libertarian ideals, and like their social conservative counterparts, they rejected higher gun norms. They were quite prepared to be held accountable for the causes they served, indeed wanted to talk about their commitments. The business lawyers, most of the business lawyers came from middle class or upper middle class backgrounds. Their fathers included a lawyer, 2 accountants, several business executives, 1 commercial real estate developer, a dentist, a scientist, and a small business owner. 6 of the 11 had attended top 20 law schools, 3 had clerked for federal judges. They worked primarily in major metropolitan areas in nicely furnished office buildings. Although all of them identified some religious affiliation, mostly mainstream Protestant and Jewish, most claimed to have only loose ties, if any, to organized religion. Typical of these lawyers was the one who described himself as Lutheran when I go to church on Christmas Eve. Another responded to my question about his religion with a kind of quizzical look, and he said, "I play golf on Sunday." Although lawyers for business organizations expressed agreement with the goals they pursued on behalf of their clients, they typically rejected the idea that their work for these organizations constituted service to any kind of cause or principle. The business lawyers generally styled themselves as moderates who could work across political lines, across ideological lines, and compromise as necessary to accomplish their clients' goals. And finally, the mediators. So the last, and in my view, a particularly interesting group of lawyers that I interviewed were those who worked for mediator organizations, these groups that seek to appeal to all the constituencies of the alliance. The lawyers who served these organizations were especially elite in terms of their educational credentials. They were mostly, though not exclusively, the children of professionals and other high-status occupational groups. All but one of them had attended a top 20 law school. 5 of 9 had clerked for federal judges. 3 had clerked for U.S. Supreme Court justices, all conservative justices. Many of them said they were active in their churches and synagogues, but none were associated with evangelical Protestant denominations. They were among the best-known lawyers I interviewed. Many of them were very well known. Their mentors were major conservative figures, including leading economists and prominent conservative judges and law professors. Most of these lawyers had served at high levels in Republican administrations. All but one lived and worked in metropolitan areas. And these lawyers were not only prominent conservatives, but also elite members of the broader legal establishment, concerned about maintaining their stature in that larger community and defending its values. The interviewed lawyers identified, without much probing from me, deep conflicts in policy objectives and values among the constituencies. So many of the libertarians, for example, sought to distance themselves from lawyers for business interests, whom they characterized as unprincipled. A property rights advocate, for one, just to give one example, asserted that business people tend to be hypocritical about regulation. He said, "It's a curious phenomenon that the captains of industry who take out full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal opposing intrusive government regulation when it comes to their opposing intrusive government regulation are the fiercest defenders and promoters of government regulation when it comes to their suburban homes and their tree-shaded lawns. They're not interested in limiting government power to regulate in that context because it serves their purposes. They're a bunch of idiots. They do not see the connection." Libertarians also emphasize their differences with social conservatives. One, for example, said, "It's important not to lose sight of what divides libertarians and social conservatives." He explained, "It's hard for libertarians to understand the legitimate role for government in deciding what people are free to choose to read or not read, what substances people choose to ingest or not ingest for medical reasons or for recreational reasons." The social conservatives similarly expressed their differences with libertarians. One of these lawyers said to me that he didn't run in the same circles as with what he called economic libertarian types. He described the libertarian's worldview as empty, lacking in moral content. A religious conservative also emphasized that he was not a federalist. He said, we use the tools that are available, and sometimes those tools have to be very large hammers delivered by Congress if it's appropriate. So we don't have a dogmatic position that the role of federal government should decrease and the role of the states increase. Many of the social conservatives disparaged the business lawyer's focus on money and prestige. One said that he had intensely disliked most of his law school classmates, whose big ambition was to work for a large, smelly, corporate, big dog law firm. Religious conservatives, he said, tend to be mistrustful of country club conservatives. A lawyer who had left a large firm, a large prominent firm, to lead a Christian organization said that he had become increasingly uncomfortable in an environment that worshipped what he called two false gods, personal autonomy and wealth. And when his partners asked him to stop praying in the office and to stop handling pro-life work pro bono, he concluded that they had begun to regard him as one of those wild-eyed evangelicals. Business lawyers also emphasized their differences with social conservatives. One said to me, "The religious right makes my flesh crawl." So what's law got to do with it? What kind of work do these lawyers perform? In what ways are they like their counterparts on the left? How do these lawyers and their organizations influence the fate of the Republican Party and the conservative movement? Well, most of the lawyers I interviewed litigated, at least sometimes, on some matters, but many of them indicated that their work was not confined to litigation or other strictly legal tasks. As I indicated at the beginning of my talk, lawyers have played lots of much broader roles in the conservative movement. These lawyers indicated that they counsel clients, of course. They do transactional work. They draft legislation and ballot initiatives. They comment on proposed rules, advise public officials, organize coalition, participate in fundraising and organizational government. Importantly, they respond to the media, frame issues in the media, write articles and columns for newspapers and magazines, and speak at conferences. Moreover, the lawyers I interviewed generally seemed to be highly sophisticated about the ways in which the various strategies they employ reinforce one another. Like their counterparts on the left, I would say, they understand that they can't focus single-mindedly on litigation, on the courts, on what law alone can deliver, and instead use a variety of tactics designed to reach the various arenas in which law and policy are shaped and made. They realize that their larger political purposes require sympathetic judges, jurors, legislators, and public audiences, that the battles in which they engage involve ideas and ideology as much as legal doctrine and statutes, and that long-term success requires building institutions with committed advocates and expertise to pursue campaigns over time. There were some differences in how the lawyers in these organizations used lawyers. So all in all, social conservative groups used fewer lawyers on average than business and libertarian groups. And here I'm just talking about the numbers of lawyers that served the organizations represented by the lawyers in my study. So I would be the first to acknowledge that that's a kind of limited basis for drawing this conclusion. But then, for what it's worth, it's consistent with other research on this point. The mean number of lawyers working for the abortion opponents and religious conservative groups were 4 and 13 respectively, whereas the libertarian business organizations used 23 and 27 lawyers on average, respectively. And that finding is consistent, as I said, with some other research on this question, but also with what these lawyers told me about their expectations about what law could deliver, what litigation could deliver, that these lawyers are not optimistic that courts and law can deliver the kinds of cultural transformations they seek. I don't mean to suggest that religious conservative groups aren't using lawyers and using litigation. In fact, to the contrary, they have built up a cadre of highly effective, highly competent, accomplished appellate advocates who have been very active, especially on religious liberties issues. But I do think it's fair to say that social conservatives have been less invested than these other constituencies, all in all, in achieving their gains through the courts. They rely more heavily than the other constituencies on grassroots outsider strategies. Okay, so obviously there's much that divides the lawyers for the different constituencies. What, if anything, draws them together and might form a basis for cooperation, other than the factors I noted at the start of this talk about there being members of the same occupation, having common occupational interests, perhaps the same professional socialization, and, of course, a desire to be part of a winning coalition. But there are a number of other elements of common ground, all of which I spent some time on in the book. To conserve time, I'll just list these other factors without really giving them their due. Perhaps there are generational effects at work here. So it was remarkable to me that so many of the lawyers I interviewed were part of two large age cohorts, one of which was coming of age during the civil rights movement, and another young of those who were young attorneys at the time. Ronald Reagan won the presidency in 1980. And there is some sociological literature that says people who share a common historical location tend to see things through a similar lens, or to have some sort of common a bond that's relevant in various ways. Many of these lawyers shared an interest in remaking the judiciary, although they didn't always agree on what kind of credentials should matter, or what it means to be, what kind of, what not only credentials, but what activism means, what disqualifying activism means. Some of them worked for organizations that had overlapping issue agendas. So libertarians, for example, sometimes found common ground with religious conservatives on issues like religious freedom and eminent domain law. But none of these is, at least according to what I could take away from the interviews, is a particularly powerful source of shared understanding. Even on the factor that seems to be most powerful, a kind of shared interest in remaking the judiciary, these lawyers often couldn't agree on what really should be important in selecting judges, and you saw these differences at play in a big way in the failed nomination of Harriet Miers for a Supreme Court seat in 2005. And in fact, it was infighting among conservatives that really doomed her nomination rather than any opposition from Democrats. And I'd be happy to talk about that if there's interest. But you see the same kinds of divisions among conservatives in a variety of other disputes in which lawyers become particularly involved. So, for example, the controversy that followed New York law firms stepping up to represent Guantanamo detainees. There was a kind of division within the conservative movement that reflected a kind of populist, elite, or establishment tension, with many conservatives in D.C. saying, oh, yes, actually, this is exactly what lawyers ought to be doing. Not just New York lawyers, but there was this division. You saw it again in the controversy over the Department of Justice's hiring practices during part of the President George W. Bush's administration, and the politicization of the hiring and promotion processes. And more recently, in disagreements over the nomination of Goodwin Liu for a seat on the Ninth Circuit, where well-known conservatives such as Ken Starr, Clint Bolick, Bob Barr, Tom Campbell may not, well, John Yoo supported Liu's nomination, but there was a great deal of opposition from other conservatives. I devote an entire chapter of the book to what I think is an especially important source of ties among lawyers for conservative and libertarian causes. And that is these mediator organizations which attempt to appeal to all strands of the conservative alliance. And some indication of the importance of these groups, I think, is indicated by the amount of foundation funding coming into them. So I just divided the organizations the lawyers served into categories and then looked at the foundation funding in this time frame going to each of these categories of organizations. And again, this is a limited sample of organizations, and yet I think the numbers going into mediator organizations is quite strikingly high, indicating that patrons at least think that these organizations are doing something important. And two of these mediator organizations focus on lawyers. The emphasis is on promoting communication and cooperation among lawyers. The Heritage Foundation has a particular project, I'll describe in a second, that is about promoting cooperation among lawyers. And of course, the Federalist Society, which you all know, I'm sure, a good deal about, is a lawyers' association. Even though it does welcome non-lawyers, clearly the emphasis is on lawyers. Let me give you a brief background, a little background on both of these organizations, even though it's quite possible you all know a great deal about both of them. The Heritage Foundation is a think tank whose primary activities include producing targeted publications, books, newsletters, articles, policy papers, and sponsoring meetings and symposia. Heritage regularly convenes meetings of activists, and it regularly convenes meetings of lawyers associated with various causes of the conservative coalition. A key figure in Heritage's attempt to coordinate the work of lawyers and to promote their cooperation is Edwin Meese, who joined Heritage in '88 at the end of his tenure as U.S. Attorney General in the Reagan administration. And Heritage is widely credited with discouraging conflict among competing conservative activists, or I shouldn't say competing, among conservative activists, and encouraging cooperation among lawyers with divergent political commitments. A lawyer who frequently attends Heritage meetings told me that they serve an exceedingly valuable function in coordinating the conservative movement and enabling diverse constituencies to operate as a loose community. The Federalist Society is another lawyer mediator organization that attempts to cultivate a network of conservative and libertarian lawyers. It sponsors debates and conferences, generates publications, convenes practice groups, and promotes lawyers' involvement in public affairs. And the Federalist Society's own promotional materials assert that it is accomplishing the goal of creating a conservative and libertarian intellectual network that extends to all levels of the legal community. And many of the lawyers I interviewed said that the Federalist Society actually does play that role, and an important role in promoting cooperation in the movement. One social conservative reported that the Federalist Society embraces both sides, traditional conservatives and libertarians, and that in his words, at least within the legal realm, the Federalist Society seems to be the vast connector. I think they have been very successful in what they set out to do. Another lawyer asserted that the Federalist Society, at least for the legal movement, is a mediating institution for the center-right. And yet another lawyer said that the Federalist Society has made a major contribution to communication within the coalition. Last year's Federalist Society annual convention included panels on limited government, constitutionality of the federal health care legislation, Dodd-Frank, financial reform, the issues of concern to libertarians and business interests, but it also had several panels designed to appeal to social conservatives, such as immigration, religious liberty, and Prop 8. And convention speakers included not only members of the the usual members of the conservative establishment who so often appear: Ed Meese, D. Boyden Gray, Charles Freed, but also Jordan Lawrence, who's senior counsel to the Alliance Defense Fund, and Patrick McSweezy, legal advisor to the Virginia Tea Party Patriots Federation. The Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society are similar in several important respects. Both were founded during the lead up to and early years of the Reagan era. Neither group attempts to articulate a consistent, precise philosophy beyond the general points outlined in their mission statements, which include language about both individual freedom and traditional values, but don't attempt to reconcile or resolve the tension between those goals. And instead, these organizations bet on the cumulative power of the commitments on which their members can agree, even when alliances are temporary and deep disagreements lurk below. They also bet on the power of networks as vehicles for influencing public policy. Both organizations have leaders who present themselves as sympathetic and trustworthy brokers, and they're able to present the different faces to the various constituencies they hope to attract. Both groups occupy network positions through which they link deeply divided elements of the coalition. And so their power flows in part from their ability to bridge constituencies that fundamentally mistrust each other. It seems to me quite plausible then, as one lawyer claimed, that the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society serve as the crossroads of the conservative movement. Other research in which I participated with the same co-authors lends support to the claim that the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation may play important roles in uniting the lawyers for the different constituencies. So in interviews, I asked lawyers whether and how often they contacted each of 50 prominent conservative and libertarian lawyers, and my co-authors and I then analyzed the patterns of contact among them using network analysis techniques I don't pretend to understand, but that's why I collaborate with co-authors who are well-versed in these techniques. So figure 6.1, this figure shows links among these 24 lawyers who were both on the list of prominent lawyers and interviewed, and the lines indicate the contacts between the notables who were both interviewed and on the list. The overall pattern shows a tightly knit core of lawyers and then a bunch of more peripheral players who have fewer ties. The next figure is exactly the same set of lawyers, the same set of points with the constituencies indicated with labels. So are the religious conservatives, the libertarians are marked with L's, and the business with B. So it shows the same pattern of contacts, but the constituencies labeled. And I think you can see that the lawyers' contacts are, the lawyers really are divided by the constituency in terms of who they interacted with. Again, not terribly surprising, but I think nonetheless interesting. There's a core in this figure of lawyers who have much more frequent contact than the others. So these are 7 lawyers who received 10 or more contacts each. And so these lawyers appear to be in a position to communicate across constituencies and perhaps to serve as brokers among them. And this next slide, again, the same lawyers, same points, but just indicating which of these people were Federalist Society members. And you see that all the members of the core indicated that they were active in the Federalist Society. I didn't, unfortunately, have the foresight to ask all these lawyers whether they were active in heritage events, but 4 of them did indicate that they were, just happened to have volunteered that they were. The data, I think, suggests, again, it's modest support for the idea that participation in Federalist Society and heritage events by these lawyers may be associated with centrality in conservative lawyer communication networks. And the clear divisions in this figure between the lawyers for the different constituencies suggests that Federalist Society and Heritage Foundation, to the extent that they're trying to coordinate, are working against some very strong centrifugal forces that divide social conservatives from libertarians and business interests. Not surprisingly, some of the lawyers I interviewed suggested that the effort by Heritage and the Federalist Society to knit social conservative lawyers together with libertarian and business interests into a cohesive network has not been entirely successful. Religious conservative lawyers expressed reservations about forging ties to business and libertarian lawyers. The lawyer networks to which these lawyers appeared to be active and committed were groups of lawyers involved in their own causes. So one said, look, there's a network of religious people and lawyers who work for them. And a pro-life activist spoke of cooperation among major religious groups and their lawyers born out of a common sense of what the gospel demands of us. Another social conservative asserted that Heritage tends to draw fewer social conservatives than libertarians. He said, there are some like-minded people like me, but there's a lot more kind of libertarian lawyers, and obviously people that really aren't totally on the same frequency ideologically. A prominent religious lawyer said, although the Federalist Society does have a religious liberty section, that's not the first thing I think of when I think of where Christian religious liberty advocates get together. A lawyer active in the Federalist Society observed that all of the prominent evangelical lawyers were somehow involved in the Federalist Society. The organization had not reached as many evangelical Protestants as it would like. He said, I think there are demographic reasons for that. They are not practicing at Wachtell Lipton in New York City. They're practicing in Tupelo, Mississippi. And our structure has really focused on major metropolitan areas. Evangelicals choose not to live in major metropolitan areas, and they choose not to make that their sort of social home. So they're out in communities like Mobile, Alabama, or Knoxville. It's hard to reach these people. The reach of the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society also may be limited in the evangelical community by lawyers' less influential roles in that strand of the coalition. So one Federalist Society member observed, does our evangelical community as a proportion track the size of that community within the conservative movement? Now that's probably how I first thought about it. And I think in the end that's not the right way to think about it. There just might be a lot of evangelicals who don't practice law. I think that's where I am at this point. So that finding or that suggestion is consistent with the point I made previously about social conservatives' more pessimistic views about what can be accomplished through litigation and law and their reliance, a greater reliance on outsider and grassroots strategies. Both Heritage and the Federalist Society appear to be more closely aligned with the establishment than with the populist rebels within the movement. Heritage, in fact, has long endured the charge that they are too much beholden to the establishment, to inside the Beltway conservatives. The Federalist Society's Board of Visitors reads like a who's who of the conservative legal establishment, with members including Ed Meese, Robert Bork, Ted Olson, William Bradford Reynolds, Paul Hodel, Michael Mukasey, and C. Boyden Gray. The Heritage Foundation and Federalist Society, it seems to me, seek to resolve conflict within the conservative coalition and to keep elites and the rank and file, if you will, in conversation, but they generally seem inclined to soothe and placate the more radical elements of the coalition rather than to side with them. So broader implications. What might we make of this? I've suggested some reasons to think that lawyers might promote communication in the conservative coalition, and some reasons to think that they actually do. And I'm concerned about going over my time, so I'm not going to present the little bit of data I have on the extent to which lawyers actually, evidence that lawyers actually do tend to suppress conflict. So essentially what it shows is that in litigation, the time frame I examined, there was very little conflict in the courts among the groups represented by these lawyers. This is the arena, the policy arena, in which you would think lawyers might have most influence, because after all, litigation is a skill that only lawyers get to exercise. And during those years, there was very little direct conflict in the courts. But that's not a particularly powerful finding, so I'll move on. But it does suggest that there is some cooperation that may be attributable to lawyers and to lawyer-mediator organizations, which I think is why philanthropists, why political patrons continue to pour a lot of money into mediator organizations, and why the Federalist Society continues to be well supported by patrons who are concerned about maintaining the conservative coalition. Okay, broader implications. I want to touch on a possibility that this research might suggest, but it may be pie in the sky. That is, how does this account, or does this account offer any reason to hope that lawyers might contribute toward healing the deep political divisions that warp our nation's political processes these days? So my research focuses on one side of the political spectrum, suggesting that lawyers may have contributed to the Republican Party's success in harnessing a political movement and finding common ground among constituencies that are much divided by class and culture and geography and ideology. But the mediating roles served by lawyers in this account span divisions within the conservative movement, within the party, and the mediator organizations I've discussed are essentially vehicles for mobilizing, organizing political support behind the GOP. Could lawyers and their organizations help to promote consensus across political lines as well? In some ways, lawyers seem unlikely candidates to play such integrative roles. The rise of conservative law movement has coincided with several trends that have fractured the American legal profession. The period has seen a death in confidence in the separation between law and politics, the idea that legal expertise gives lawyers a special vantage point that enables them to offer superior and politically neutral advice about the content of law. All of the arenas in which lawyers work, including not only domestic courts, agencies, legislatures, and the media, but also bar associations, law faculty, hiring committees, and international institutions, are now sites of adversarial advocacy, or at least infighting, on behalf of competing interests and ideologies. And the profession, meanwhile, has become more diverse, more specialized, more stratified during the past few decades than ever before. And American lawyers are more deeply divided than ever before by practice areas, income, and types of clients served. And yet, I think there is something to the idea that lawyers might promote consensus across political lines, that there are some reasons to think that might be possible. My research focuses on lawyers associated with causes of the right and their battles with activist lawyers of the political left. My previous research was all about civil rights and poverty lawyers, lawyers associated with the political left. But most American lawyers are not so clearly committed to either camp, either the left or the right, just as most American citizens are neither red nor blue, but purple. So are most lawyers, and their law school training equips them to appreciate both sides of an argument. And so perhaps lawyers' generally moderate political leanings and their ability to take stock of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the positions of opposing flanks of extreme partisans might predispose them to facilitate the kinds of structured public conversations necessary to tackle some of this country's most daunting and divisive problems. In theory, lawyers might be able to help rescue public policy from extreme elements and participate in organizing what has been called the radical center, citizens who want to achieve reasonable, fair, and just outcomes. Doing so would require mediator organizations of a different type than I've studied in this research, a set of institutions devoted to promoting reasoned debates and accommodation across political lines, or at least across a much larger part of the political spectrum than the organizations I've focused on here. And in my view, such mediation would really nicely complement the roles played by most of the conservative and libertarian lawyers considered in my research and the lawyers of the left with whom they battle. So I've gone a little over, but I would love to hear from you if you have reactions or questions.